Hello, everybody, and welcome to our very last episode in our series, Finding Myself in Torah. In this episode, we're going to be speaking to Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, who is someone I've been following for a long time. She is a very accomplished journalist and the Rebbetzin of the Alt News Shul. She has written a few pieces that really intrigued me, and I really wanted to explore with her more. One was a piece where she speaks about going to attend this shiur of Haredi women learning Gemara in Israel, and how that what that did to her and how that impacted her. Another one is an article where she spoke about going to the Kines HaShluchos and observing sort of the role that shluchos played in their communities in terms of like having their own sense of leadership and influence. And the last one was a recent article that she put out about materialism in the frum community, and there was a few lines in there where she spoke specifically about how that influences women. You know, in her words, materialism can provide a safe haven for female self-actualization. In communities where women are largely kept on the margins of meaningful leadership. And she speaks about how she sees the link between opportunities for more serious Torah learning and leadership, and the investment in materialism in the community. So all of these, a lot of fascinating topics, so much to explore, and I'm really excited for you to listen to this conversation with Avital. So Avital, an article you wrote a couple years ago for Tablet was one that really intrigued me. You wrote about going to this class with Haredi women in Israel studying Talmud. And you spoke about how when you were in this class, you felt like you were drowning in a sea of learning, even though you yourself have a very strong learning background as well. But something about that experience kind of showed you that there's a whole other depth of Torah that you never really explored. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that experience, and maybe just in general, how your role as a journalist has shaped your relationship with Torah learning and what might be possible for you in your own Torah learning.
Wow, that is a deep and multi-layered question. So that evening was a magical evening for me. I attended this Gemara class, as you said, that was done by a Rosh Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And he was teaching this group of Haredi women. I would say it's a mix of ages, probably skewed a little bit younger, but you had this incredible buzz in the room of like a real Beit Midrash feeling, and a very sort of unusual optics, meaning not the usual type of look of a Beit Midrash, whether women's Beit Midrash, and certainly not like anything like a men's yeshiva. And sitting there, I definitely felt like I was illiterate unfortunately, in a lot of our fundamental texts, specifically Torah Sheba'al Peh. I don't know if I would say I'm deeply steeped in learning. I think I had a sort of very classical girls' day school education. Baruch Hashem, I'm grateful for it, but it was decently strong. But still, in comparison with what I know I could be, with what I know I could have been, I think it's not as great as it could be. I'll put it that way. So it was also very interesting, by the way, because obviously in Israel it's a different environment. You're dealing with a population that is fluent in Hebrew. The level of learning is just incomparable with anything I've seen in the United States, specifically in women's learning. So that also, my Hebrew is pretty decent, but even so, just the power of the language, of being fluent in the language, and the way that it could be used in learning purposes, I think a lot of American Jews don't really understand. Even like from, day school system graduates don't realize how disadvantaged they are without the fluency of Hebrew. So that was another point that I thought about a lot that evening. As a journalist, I bring a lot of things, I think, into my work, both into my work as a journalist and also as a Rebbetzin. I think, in many ways, with almost a literary analytical tool perspective. I think in the way that one would in a literature course in university. That's often how I teach Tanakh, with that sort of mentality, with that kind of seminar discussion of trying to understand what the pasuk is saying, what is said, what is not said, the style in which it is written, etc. But so there's, I think, a lot of overlap there in terms of my writer, storyteller side and my teacher side / student. I see myself more a student than a teacher. But I think also more broadly, and I don't think I've ever said this out loud before, I think that journalism, doing this work, has allowed me to have a little bit of a moralist perspective on things, which is to say that when I teach, I'm not getting too nitty-gritty that I'm losing sight of the larger moral question or dilemma that is appearing in whatever we are studying. And I think that's really important, because I think a lot of teachers and shiurim and classes miss out on that. They're focused on the technicalities without really zooming out and trying to understand what is this telling us about ourselves or our society that could be better. And journalism is very much devoted to that pursuit, to understanding that. So I think that overlap is very potentially powerful.
Nice. Awesome. So, you mentioned in that article that, more advanced women's Torah learning, or specifically like Gemara learning, is still somewhat rare or controversial, even in Israel, with the the language advantage. What do you think are the costs when women don't have access to that serious Torah learning?
There is the obvious, and then there's the less obvious answer to that question. The obvious answer is just being not fluent in our, not only halacha, but just us understanding the process through which halacha is constructed and understood and developed over the years. I think that is very a practical application of that issue, right? A lot of women feel very disempowered in halachic observance because they just don't have that background that allows them to feel strong in their observance. On a deeper level, there is also, I think, a power imbalance that happens in the frum community because of women's illiteracy and lack of access, which is, we are in a community, Baruch Hashem, that is the people of the book, as we are called. We define ourselves by our study. We're supposed to, at least. And when women don't have access to the same study opportunities that men do, there will inevitably be reflections of that in the power structures and who calls the shots in everything, in community politics, in institutions, in philanthropy, whatever it is. In culture building, women have less, I think, of an influence because they don't have that key, which is given only through Torah study.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think something I actually, at the conference I initially met you at, one thing that was mentioned there when they were talking about women's Torah leadership was the fact that learning itself, in our community, learning itself is leadership. Exactly. we place so much value on the knowledge of Torah itself that itself is a form of leadership in our community. So maybe you can give some more specific direction of what do you see. You mentioned sort of these trends of there's often a lot more opportunity for men. There's daf yomi, there's regular shiurim and things like that, and often what's offered for women in some communities is more just a little bit of inspiration here and there. What do you think? What do you see, or do you envision being a way we can create more of this substantial, ongoing Torah learning opportunities for women?
So this is something I deal with every single day in my role, really, in Manhattan, with our shul that we built, my husband and I, on the Upper East Side. And it is a question that I think not enough of us are grappling with. As you said, I think most women's programming is, I'm just going to be polite, it's very lacking. And I can't tell you how many times I have attended a women's shiur where I'm excited to learn from someone here in the States, and the whole shiur, from the beginning till the end, is maisalach. Stories. Just a storyteller, And it's not even a great magid. It's story after story. Hashgacha pratis, Hashem really is with us. So lacking in substance. So, not one pasuk is quoted. Not one sefer, not one Musar scholar, nothing. It is unbelievable to me how we dilute ourselves, and I think it's far more common among women's programming than men's. Certainly this exists, I think, in the men's space, but there's definitely an aspiration, at least the elite studies, right? At all stages in life, where whatever you do with your day-to-day, that you make time, you're a kovei itim, and you have time to really study. And for women, it's not the same. I see a lot of people gravitate towards this sort of content that I call sort of like fast food Judaism, where it's just like 3 minutes of inspiration, and it's not even rooted in actual anything sometimes. It's just like people just bluffing, sort of, just talking without rooting themselves in our actual Masorah. So I think it's a really big issue, and I think there are a lot of bigger cultural implications of that. I think that women are being pushed into, really relegated into activities that are antithetical to so much of what a Torah community should be about, because there is no space for them to really learn and grow in a deep way, right? The issue of materialism is very much tied to this, I think.
Yeah.
But in terms of what is the answer, I will say one of the biggest challenges that I see as a Rebbetzin of a community that we also have to figure out how to shift is specifically when it comes to mothers of children, of small children, the challenge of finding time and a space where mothers can come and learn is very great. Women who are not married tend to show up to shiurim, or women who are married before having children, they have obviously much more flexibility. Mothers with children don't really have the support system that they need in order to prioritize learning. So I think that in order to do the type of programming locally in communities, wherever we are, number one, we need to figure out how can we shift that, whether it's providing childcare in institutions so that women can come and leave a baby with a babysitter or just have the baby on them or something, or changing cultures where husbands feel a certain responsibility to support their wives in learning as well, right? We have the reverse. I think that needs to be invested into. That's sort of on the broader level, but we do need training of educators, I think, as well, high-level educators for women. I think it's very, very hard to find great Torah teachers. I hate to say this, but it's been a struggle because I've been so devoted to trying to find women scholars to teach. And here in the States, I think we have a real dearth. From Israel, I can bring in 1 million, Baruch Hashem. There's so many brilliant women scholars who can teach, but they're all based in Israel. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. The Torah comes from Zion. Yeah. But here in the States, we are dealing with a desert, and the question is really how can we invest in building and training women to put time into this, into honing their skills, both as students and also eventually as teachers, as presenters of ideas, the ability to present a number of sources, to go through them, to come with a theme, with a narrative arc of some kind, with a call to action at the end. Those are skills that can be taught, but we need to be putting more time into that.
Yeah. If I could just push back on what you said a little bit.
Sure.
You know, so you were saying how a lot of women's shiurim will be a little bit more like story-oriented and less rigorous. And there might be some people who say like, oh, that's what, especially maybe, you know, women at certain stages of life, and it's harder for them to kind of invest in more rigorous learning, where they're like, oh, that's kind of what I want. That's what speaks to me. Sure. And some people might say like, oh, like the lived experience of Judaism, that's like also really valuable and important. So, which I'm sure you're not arguing with, but I think what would you say is missing, and like why is it so important to fill this gap for the more, you know, rigorous textual learning as well?
There's definitely room for that. And don't get me wrong, there are many women who want that.
Yeah.
But I think they want that because they've never experienced great rigorous learning. And I say that as someone who myself feel that I did not experience great rigorous learning until I arrived in Stern. And I had a Tanakh teacher who just blew my mind with the way that she taught and the way that it was so obviously deeply connected to my life. And I think just women are not aware of that. That's the truth. That they're not aware that like you can actually open a chumash. Talking about just like, let's start with the weekly parsha, right? And just and feel instantly connected with the right teacher who's going to show you those connections. So I think a lot of it is just women don't have good experiences, frankly.
Yeah.
And yes, of course, everyone loves a good story, but there has to be a balance. There has to be some rigor. There has to be some challenge. People are not challenged in their Judaism as adults. That's a problem. And I think that's true both in the more modern spaces and in the more right-wing spaces. People are not challenged to grow internally. I'm not saying throughout your smartphone type of growth. I'm saying actually, maybe though that's a good idea. But
not bad.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The ability to grow in learning is not something that is pushed as much in American communities.
So, okay, so I think this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is like your own personal journey. So you ended off that article with, I'm just going to quote what you said. You said, you asked yourself, how could I read another book on Jewish thought when I still have not tasted the most central text of my Torah observance? So you said like you picked up a Gemara Brachas, and that's sort of what you thought to yourself. And maybe tell us like more about what happened next. I know I've heard you talk about this a little bit in other places, a little bit about your journey of sort of as an adult, like challenging yourself to rediscover your like, you know, Torah learning for yourself. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that, like what sort of like inspired that push to rediscover, and what was the journey like?
So I wish that I could give you a neat story in which there's like a perfect ending to it. Yes, I did learn brachot, Masachet Brachot, thanks to beautiful Koren edition of Masachet. But that's not the only piece of the story. I think Rabbi Sachs it was who said that if you really want to learn, you have to teach. That the only way that you're going to be pushed to study deeply is by being pushed to teach. And in the last few years, that's what I've taken on wholeheartedly. I don't know how I have found the time for it, but somehow I carved time out for it. It's the only way. And it's really been in pushing myself to teach within my community on totally different subjects, different groups of people. Sometimes it's 100 people for a shiur after Shabbos morning after Kiddush. Sometimes it's, you know, a monthly class I do for young women in the community. I've been doing all kinds of different formats and different subjects. So sometimes it is a weekly parsha, but many times I'll choose a theme and I will go through Tanakh on it, Gemaras on it certainly, and also later more modern sources including Chassidut. So I enjoy really looking at things thematically sometimes. But it's been a journey because community service has pushed me to study. And it's so interesting because I never saw myself as that person. I was not one of those girls going for Jewish education, I'm going to be a Mora, I'm going to go into administration. Like I had a lot of friends who were in that direction professionally, and I never saw myself as that. I was sort of, like as I said, I was going for journalism, I was going in a literary direction, and obviously I care deeply about learning, and there's a certain pull to my soul in it, and that I wanted to learn more, but at the same time I saw a real need in the community, and I felt like if there is no woman, be the woman, to paraphrase rather. So that's really the story. I mean, it's an ongoing journey for me, and I'm definitely investing more and more time, I would say, into learning and also building my own curriculum. It's something I've spent a lot of time on, building my own, not just source sheets, but also perspectives on things, my own theses on certain ideas. And it's been really rewarding to be able to do that kind of learning. The Gemara that talks about, and Shabbat that talks about the 6 questions that we were asked. after 120 years. And it's a famous Gemara that talks about Sipita Yeshua. And one of the questions we're asked is, have you come up with chidushim? Right? Not just kovei itim. Not only have you made time to learn, but also have you come up with chidushim? And I think that's a really important piece. I think a lot of us don't feel empowered or moved or inspired enough to get to that point that we're not only learning, we're actually being pushed to come up with our own ideas. We're actually being pushed to partake in a millennia-old discourse between people of ideas. What role, what voice are we playing in that? And I think a lot of us feel, well, no, that was for previous generations. We're not great enough. But no, we are called upon to partake in that discourse. And I think that's a forgotten piece.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned your role as Rebbetzin of a shul. So there's another piece that you wrote, actually, that also I read a long time ago that really struck me, where you wrote about going to the Kinnes HaShluchos, the Chabad Shluchos convention, and realizing that the women there were, an integral part of the, Shluchos, enterprise. They weren't just like a sidekick alongside the rabbi, but they themselves had the title shlucha, right? Not just, and you sort of described it as like solving the Rebbetzin problem in a sense of like not just being a Rebbetzin, being someone married to a rabbi, but like they having their own sort of role. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that experience, has that influenced your own perspective on your role as a Rebbetzin in your shul, and in general, like how do you see, women's leadership in community settings in that way?
So it definitely had a big impact on me at the time. Not that anything was shocking to me about being at the Kinnes HaShluchos, and I've been there a few times. I knew what it is and how the enterprise works, but I think coming back to it as someone who had been as a wife of a rabbi for several years sort of made me think about the role of a woman as a community leader. And what's interesting is that when I wrote that piece, I was not really in the position that I'm in right now. So since then, Baruch Hashem, my husband and I co-founded our own shul, which we co-lead in many, many ways. And it's very strongly Orthodox. There's no question about that. But I play a serious role, I would say, in leading at his side, in making policy decisions, budget considerations, staffing, hashkafic questions. Where are we investing our time and effort into? What ideas or what initiatives are we pushing? Are we encouraging our congregants to consider? Those types of things are all day and night, literally 24/7. That is my life. So in that way, ironically, when I wrote that essay years before, I never imagined that I would be in this position of very similar to a shlucha in the sense that, co-founding a community, co-leading it, and there are a lot of interesting parallels. And what was interesting was when I was writing the piece at the time, we were at a sort of quote-unquote modern Orthodox, old, stuffy Manhattan synagogue that had certainly no room for female leadership, but also it was like I just happened to be married to the rabbi there. I was an appendage, it's your arm candy. And then suddenly, in this new chapter, Baruch Hashem, I'm able to sort of step in a different way. And frankly, the reason I do this is not because I need this in my life, and it's not because I enjoy the utter lack of privacy and constant scrutiny, but rather because I think, once again, if we have an issue in the wider Orthodox community around women's leadership and roles, and I felt like Hashem was almost laughing at me because for the 10 years beforehand, I had been writing very strongly, very passionately about women's issues. And I felt like Hashem put me into this position and was like, okay, you preached for 10 years, now go do it. Go figure this out. So that's really the only reason I've taken this on with as much force as I have, because I really believe that it just doesn't exist as much in our community. There are a lot of reasons for why they do. Some of them are social conditioning, some of them are frankly economic, but I feel like it is really one of my tafkidim in this life is to do this, to be this person, in order for other communities and women generally to see that it could be done differently.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that point, like, I know I've heard you speak about how sort of encouraging, people women in Rebbetzin roles to move beyond just like the cooking and the baking and the hosting, but also being engaged in a more serious way in the community issues, in the teaching, in the, more deep influential parts of the role. What advice would you give to other women in those positions and how they can, I guess, sort of learn from the model that you're creating?
Listen, I just want to acknowledge my Baruch Hashem, my privilege at this point. A lot of it is also because we co-founded a shul.
Right.
I will say that if we had entered a shul where, a board had chosen us and, I had gone through the usual rigmarole of a rabbinical couple going through interviews, where they interview the wife even though she's not even being employed by the synagogue. That happens all the time. If we had gone through that sort of more classical model, which is why I think the Chabad model is more relevant to us, it would be very different. Here I felt like I had much more agency than I think a typical Rebbetzin does. But if that agency is within reach to a rabbinic couple and specifically to a Rebbetzin, I encourage everyone to take it. Really, tnu lanu achuzah, take that achuzah, take that portion. And I mean, there's so many things to be said about what it takes to lead a community and to do so with grace, and also while protecting yourself. I'm still working on the latter, frankly. But a lot of it, I think, actually comes back to learning, which is what you said, that learning is leadership, as we talked about at that conference where we met. I really believe a lot of it is that. And by the way, there could be different ways of doing this. For example, something else I learned from Chabad. When as a journalist, interestingly, I visited Russia in it must have been 2013 or 2014. It was 2013. I was in Moscow, actually for Tablet, and I was doing a story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe's library that was in dispute with the Russian government. And one of my conversations was with Rabbi Rav Baruch Gorem. Okay, he's a respected rabbi in Moscow in the Chabad community there, and he was showing me in his office one of his big initiatives, which is a publishing house called Knyizhniki. Okay, Knyizhniki is a Russian language literary publishing outfit that I don't know exactly the structuring of it, but bottom line is they translate and publish great Jewish literature in like a beautiful new Russian translation. Because he explained to me that Russian Jews relate to, like, one of the entry points to Judaism is through culture, and specifically through high literature. And the way to do it is to just, sometimes is to give people Isaac Bashevis Singer or Isaac Babel to connect to Judaism in this sort of, not a roundabout way, but like it's not the usual Kiruv tactic that you're used to hearing at an Olami conference, like how to make people frum in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I was really taken by that approach because obviously I'm a Russian Jew myself and I come from that world, but I think it was so beautifully sensitive to people, to really understanding your audience, to understanding, okay, this is what makes people tick. They care about literature. They care about the arts. They care about all these things that the typical frum person from the American Jewish community might not think is so essential to Judaism, but for this population it is, right? And they went into that direction, and I think that's so powerful. So, which brings me to my point, which is, I think we often have to think creatively about how to bring people closer to Judaism. And I think that's true, again, both in more modern spaces and more right-wing spaces, regardless of the flavor of your Judaism. And it's to think also as a Rebbetzin, what makes you tick? I don't think every woman is naturally dreaming of running challah bakes. I just don't. So for some women, it's wonderful and it's beautiful, but it's just not every woman's calling. So there are other things that can be meaningful, and it doesn't always need to be also giving a high-level shiur. It can also be organizing. Again, one thing that I'm very busy with is organizing Jewish book events. We started an art gallery within the shul. We're bringing in religious Jewish artists to present their work in order to support them, specifically from coming from Israel, but also for people to connect to Yiddishkeit through art, right? Doing things like that that's a little bit out of the box, it makes me so happy. And I think, and I see obviously my community loves it as well, otherwise I wouldn't do it. But I think a lot of Rebbetzins have opportunities to think creatively about community programming that can really, really deepen and expand and tighten their communities in beautiful ways. And they just have to think about what makes them excited. For some people, mental health is a very big passion, right? So like doing more events around that, or maybe it's running support groups of that kind. Something that, whatever makes you lighten up, excited, activated, figure that out and how you can channel that into community service.
Nice. That's good. Good answer.
Thanks.
So, okay, I want to turn the conversation now to a fascinating article you published recently about materialism in the frum community, which I read and was really, fascinated by. Of course, I was specifically excited about the part where you speak about how it affects women in particular. And you spoke about how like some of the most influential Orthodox women today are those who are, I'm just quoting your article, those who peddle wigs, food, attire, and general aspirational lifestyle content. So I guess maybe share a little bit about your thoughts on that. And because you mentioned this earlier, how you feel like the lack of serious, rigorous learning is linked to this materialism, and specifically how the culture of materialism affects women specifically. So I would love to hear you share a little bit more about that. It was a very short few lines in your article, so I want to hear more.
Like there was an article, betocha article.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
There's like levels of it. Yes. So, I mean, I don't think this is a big thesis statement at this point. I think it's pretty much accepted that some of the biggest, I don't know if leaders is the right word, but influencers in the sense that culture makers are people who are peddling and pushing certain lifestyle. And largely that is materialistic. And I think largely the reason for that is, first of all, it's generally cultural. This is not at all unique to our community. I don't want to point a finger at our community as uniquely culpable in this. By the way, if you look at other religions, we see the same thing. We see this in the evangelical Christian community for women specifically, and also in the religious Muslim community. If you look at Muslim American female influencers, you'll see a lot of this. And there's a lot of what we talked about in that article. Professor Chaim Saiman and I, we spoke about the mitzvahification of materialism. So it's like, well, if you spend a lot on X piece of Judaica, on dresses, on chaitels, whatever it is, that the items, the objects, or the experiences that define our lives as Orthodox Jews, then it's okay because it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah, it's a mitzvah. So there are obvious, the challenges here are self-evident, right? I don't really have to lay them out. Number one, classism is a big issue in our community, and I say this as someone who does not come from a privileged background at all. My parents are Russian-speaking immigrants. We really, really came to this country with nothing. I was a scholarship kid my entire life. To the extent that I remember once my parents couldn't make the yeshiva's tuition payments on time, and they did not give me textbooks at the beginning of the year as a way to punish me. And I'll never forget that for the rest of my life. So I think there's a lot of that in our community, and we don't really talk about it because it's uncomfortable. It's certainly uncomfortable to talk about money, and everyone is very busy with presenting their most successful selves. But we have an issue. We have a real issue here on affordability. People are just barely making it work, and then at the same time, the average person is being pushed to spend inordinate amounts of money in order just to make it in the frum community. And that's true, by the way, out of town as well. I've spoken to a lot of women, I think, even in communities where you don't think this is as prevalent. It's all relative, certainly, but you're seeing versions of this in different ways. So that to me is the most concerning part of this, is that there's the haves and the have-nots, and what happens to the have-nots in a community where the haves, when your self-actualization is only through the material, right? And I think that's specifically true about women. Guys can push back on me about this, but because women don't have the same opportunities to identify themselves as professionally or also spiritually in the way that men might, we put ourselves into the material aspects. And if you look at any female frum magazine, that is going to be the main focus. So how do we get out of that? How do we get out of that rut that a lot of us find ourselves in when we are being told to focus on, I don't even want to get into like examples, but just there are myriads of examples, and I think that any frum woman listening to this can color in the lines here in what I'm saying, and whatever she's personally struggling with in that moment. And how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond those aspirations to something much deeper?
Yeah. So I'll just share a perspective that I've heard from other people, which is that, maybe we could say that, like, okay, traditionally the woman's role is more of like, a homemaker, having this more maternal figure, where part of her like spiritual role is to care for her home and be invested to some degree in those more material things. That doesn't have to be viewed as a bad thing. That could be viewed as a positive thing for her to be like invested in those things. And I guess what would you say to that in terms of where does the materialism to an excessive degree come in, where it actually becomes, harmful or detrimental and no longer like a spiritual pursuit?
I think we should just take a step back. That's true about a homemaker. Well, let's take a step back and consider the differences in the way that homes looked. I was born in 1991. I'm 33.
Yeah.
In the way that the average frum home looked in the 90s versus today.
Yeah.
That's the question, and I don't need to answer that question, right? Kids shared bedrooms. You did not need a massive estate in Tom's River or Muncie or whatever you're living, with each child with their own private room. I mean, just like, and by the way, I'm saying things that people say to me all the time from my sources within the frum community, right? Like, this is not something that I'm even busy with, but it's something that a lot of people have shared with me, and I think people share with me both because of my journalist role and also my Rebbetzin role. People share their pain with me, and there's a lot of pain around this. There's a lot of pain in the expectations that we have somehow built of keeping up with the Cohens, right? So I think let's just take a step back. Like, homemakers looked very different a few decades ago, right? You did not have a linen closet filled with, 10 different $300-400 tablecloths for Shabbos and Yom Tov. Like, that was not a norm. These things are becoming normal, or expectations or pressures on a lot of specifically women. The amount of food that we feel we have to serve at a Shabbos meal, the clothing. I mean, I don't know if I put this into the article in the end, but someone once told me, and it was hilarious because I later found out to be very true, that there was a woman who was packing for a Pesach program, and she used to pack a different outfit for every single meal of the whole 10 days. And she said now she doesn't have to do it anymore because she already married off all her kids. So
wow.
She could wear the same outfit for a whole day. Doesn't have to, So whatever those things are, right? Whatever this narishkeit is that we are busy with, I think the homemaker thing is still true, but the question is, how much do we allow it to get to us? How much do we allow it to affect us? A lot of our perceptions are created by social media, and I think also print media in the frum community. We get a lot of the pressure comes from there, with those aspirations, with those expectations. How do we know it's too much? We know it's too much when it distracts us from loftier aspirations. We know it's too much when it affects us in our professional decisions and the way that we spend our time. And that looks differently from every single person, but I really believe that that's sort of the best way to crystallize. How are you spending your time?
Yeah.
Right? Are you shopping? Are you, whatever it is, I don't even know. Like, but I think for a lot of people, it takes up so much time and also mental energy to be busy with this, right? To even discussions, like, over all of this. It's so, when you take a step back and you realize a role that it plays in your life, that's when you probably understand you have to, scale back. And again, for every single person, that answer looks differently, and in different communities it looks differently. But I think a lot of it is materialism it's the only way that a lot of women can self-actualize, can differentiate themselves from other women. And it gives them, sadly, almost a sense of purpose, a fleeting, very fleeting sense of purpose that will never be satisfied. And if it could be redirected towards spiritual growth, and frankly, again, I think we need to think more broadly about spiritual growth. It doesn't mean that, I think a lot of reason why women are not drawn to that spiritual growth trajectory is because the options and the way that it looks and feels isn't always exciting. If it's to listen to a not great speaker on some website that you're trying to find a share on, like, of course it's not going to excite you. Of course you're not going to grow. You're just not going to do it. You're just going to go find something else to do with your time. So we need to be offering better trajectories for women and better aspirations for women to be going in that direction, if you ask me.
Yeah. Okay, to give us an underrated learning suggestion, something that women might not know about or might not think is for them, but you believe could be really transformative for them.
I kind of referred to this earlier, and I cannot say this enough. Learn Hebrew. It's so basic, but I really believe Ivrit is the tool to everything. And a lot of us don't have it. And when I sit with women who are day school graduates, who went to great schools, and I realize how weak their Hebrew is, I'm shocked. And I really, if there's any way to improve your Hebrew, again, think creatively about it. Read Israeli newspapers. Follow Israeli news people on Instagram. Watch Israeli films. It sounds crazy. Like, what does that have to do with Torah? It has to do with it, because you have to be able to be fluent in this in order to really unlock what we're learning. Certainly, learning with translation is wonderful, and do it, and don't be afraid of it. It's just as meaningful. Every shir I give, I offer always both, and sometimes, by the way, the frum women are like, they're not even sure if it's real. Does it really count as learning if I'm doing it in English? Yes, it does count as learning. But learn Hebrew.
Yeah, totally. I think the fluency is so key, and I feel like the way someone once said to me is like, when you open a siddur and you say the words, and totally. It's your fluent language, it feels
a
different.
Dialogue. You're 100% right. Just in davening, like, the ability to really feel that you are speaking, to really connect to it in that way, I think is really important. And we don't invest enough into that.
Yeah. Awesome. Avital, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time.
I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, this is great.
Gives some chidushim.
If you listened to this episode and it inspired you to want to take the next step in investing in your own Torah learning and really trying to rediscover Yiddishkeit and Torah in a new way, then I invite you to come check out some of the offerings that we have on our website. We have courses that we offer. We have books that you can buy to do learning on your own. We have an online and in-person based medrash if you want to invest in a more intensive, committed learning routine in your day. We have so much to offer and really want to do what we can to help you start that journey of investing in Torah in a way that's meaningful and personal and really transformative. I hope you enjoy.